Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating trip back to the 1990s to look at a massive cultural touchstone, one that actually doubled as a hidden developmental sandbox for millions of kids. We're talking about what happened when an entire generation stepped into the virtual world of Kanto in Pokémon Red and Blue, and did it completely alone. We are going to rigorously analyze how an unguided playthrough of this game was, in reality, an absolute masterclass in problem-solving and cognitive growth.
So let's dive right into this overarching question. What actually happens to a child's mind when they refuse the walkthrough? We're exploring the deep pedagogical value of confronting really complex digital obstacles without any external cheats, no strategy guides, and no older siblings sitting next to you telling you exactly what to do. Think about it. What happens to a young, developing mind when the game world is completely uncompromising and the player is forced to just figure it out entirely on their own terms? It's a fascinating psychological space.
Here is our roadmap for the analysis today. First, we'll look at the guideless digital sandbox. 2. Decoding the game's language. 3. Scarcity and spatial reasoning. 4. Adult strategy versus child logic. 5. The Elite Four Gauntlet. And finally, we will wrap up with the value of the struggle.
All right, starting with Part 1, the guideless digital sandbox, or refusing the walkthrough.
You really have to think about the sheer scale of the challenge for, say, a 5-year-old kindergartner stepping into Kanto for the first time. The heavy, gray plastic of that classic hardware wasn't just a toy, it was a contained portal for self-taught mastery. There was genuine risk and consequence. There was no internet you could just pull up on a phone for quick answers. The screen was the entire universe. When you were standing right there before Professor Oak's 3 Pokeballs, the stakes felt incredibly real. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does the artificial scarcity of a 1990s digital environment contrast with modern game design, which relies so heavily on instant gratification and glowing waypoints to guide you everywhere? Back then, every patch of tall grass held wild encounters, and every single battle was a lesson that you learned the hard way.
Moving right along to Section 2, decoding the game's language, where the interface itself acts as pedagogy.
Now, what's really interesting about this early phase is that before any battles could actually be won, the interface itself had to be decoded. You have to frame the game's menus and battle mechanics not just as gameplay, but almost as a foreign language. Every icon and every number represented a complex system that had to be learned through raw curiosity. There were no pop-up tooltips holding your hand. For example, choosing a starter like Squirtle, which is often considered the smooth operations choice because it gives you a really steady early pacing and great mid-game versatility, meant a player quickly learned how to navigate battles. But figuring out exactly why water-type moves beat rock-type Pokémon, that wasn't handed to you. That was a profound revelation earned through repeated failure and trial by fire.
So to what extent did this total lack of external knowledge actually enforce a pure application of the scientific method in children? Well, by interacting with this tactile interface, hitting those simple buttons, a child was actually engaging in exact hypothesis testing. They tested ideas. They learned that if you hit a wild Pokémon too hard, it just faints and it's gone. But weakening it just enough to toss a Pokéball and hear it click shut, grasping that mechanic was a massive moment of self-taught mechanical mastery.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that failure wasn't a deterrent. It wasn't designed to make you quit. It was actually the primary feedback loop driving the player toward genuine comprehension. Arriving at the first gym in Fuchsia City with just a Squirtle and a lot of raw determination meant facing a designed obstacle that demanded preparation. And when the logic finally clicked intuitively, when Squirtle's bubble washed away Geodude in a single hit after all those losses, the reward was immediate, validating, and just deeply, deeply satisfying.
Which brings us to Section 3, Scarcity and Spatial Reasoning and the Psychological Hurdles of the Mid-Game.
Let's map out these specific in-game obstacles as actual developmental milestones. If you look at the progression here, a child had to evolve from just reactive scrambling to true anticipatory planning. Around hour 5 in Fuchsia City, it demands preparation. By hour 12 in Emmett Moon, it demands spatial memory. And by hour 25, when they reached LT Surge's gym, they were faced with a puzzle of hidden switches in identical trash cans. If you chose the wrong trash can, the whole puzzle reset. It was brutal, but it forced a major cognitive transition from random button mashing to methodical deduction and close observation. And think about Mount Moon for a second. Without a minimap, without quest markers or glowing arrows telling you where to go, navigating these dark, maze-like winding tunnels became a pure, unassisted exercise in spatial memory.
Getting completely lost was simply part of the process, and finally finding the exit required immense, extreme patience from a kid. Then, deep inside that cave, they hit a singular defining choice: the dome or helix fossil. You could only choose one, and the choice was permanent, with totally unknown outcomes. Making this blind leap of faith proved to a kindergartner that their decisions carried permanent weight in this digital world, requiring careful forethought. It fostered an incredibly deep attachment to their specific playthrough. In fact, this attachment was so strong that many kids famously refused playground trades. They wouldn't swap their copy of Pokémon Blue for newer, arguably less substantial games, like a generic King Kong movie tie-in, because they inherently understood the value of the unique journey they were actively building.
And that leads us to consider the broader psychological impact. How does artificial scarcity in a digital environment foster real-world deferred gratification? With no guide telling you which tough battles were coming up next, items became incredibly precious. Budgeting your limited Pokédollars for an antidote instead of splurging on something flashy literally teaches a genuinely adult concept: deferred gratification through a pixelated convenience store. When resources are scarce, you quickly learn that every single decision matters.
All right, let's impartially contrast all of this in Section 4, Adult Strategy versus Child Logic.
The visual contrast in mindsets here is absolutely fascinating. An experienced solo adult player prioritizes a mathematically balanced team, grabbing an early Moonstone for a Nidoking or utilizing a Jolteon. They keep their team evenly distributed around level 55. They want balanced type coverage via TMs and utility Pokémon like a Snorlax, Sponge. Children, on the other hand, operate purely on the rule of cool. They will funnel absolutely all their experience points into a massive level 82 Charizard, drag around a level 30 Pikachu just because they saw it in the anime, and keep a bunch of under-leveled HM mules purely to cut down bushes. It's a massive level gap with a totally neglected team.
Now, the solo strategy is undeniably effective, right? Utilizing Jolteon's high-speed mechanics to ensure massive critical hits, or teaching Ice Beam to Blastoise for long-term coverage. But we must treat the child's strategy with dignity here. Mathematically, it's highly inefficient to spam 4 Fire-type moves on one Charizard, or to buy a seemingly useless Magikarp for 500 Pokédollars and spam potions mid-battle just to slowly evolve it. But it is a remarkably valid and pure form of resourcefulness. They relied on raw attachment and just brute forced their way through battles through sheer perseverance. When that raw attachment met a wall they couldn't immediately overcome, frustration wasn't the end of the story. Defeat was merely an opportunity to adapt the plan. Running at a gym leader, losing, collecting some XP, and coming back stronger planted a vital seed of deep self-belief. They learned, firsthand, that they could navigate incredibly difficult things completely alone.
But eventually, that resilience is pushed to its absolute limit in Section 5, the Elite Four Gauntlet, the ultimate wall.
Because eventually, sheer brute force hits a mathematical limit. The climax of the journey forces the player to face 4 consecutive masters without healing at a Pokémon Center. It demanded serious stamina and deep game grit. Facing this gauntlet, a child with an unbalanced team was in for a major shock. Lorelei's ice types punished anyone who over-relied on an early-game flying type. Bruno tested their long-term PP, their move points, resource management across multiple battles. Agatha harshly taught them about immunities, proving that normal-type moves literally do 0 damage to ghost types. And Lance's dragons demanded specialized counters or massive grinding that a kid with a single over-leveled starter simply didn't have. They were forced to think critically about typing and item conservation under immense, relentless pressure.
And this brings us to what I like to call the legendary clutch. This is the ultimate, brilliant Gen 1 rite of passage. When that over-leveled Charizard finally, inevitably failed against Lance's dragons, the child had to pivot. They realized they had Master Balls, and they had access to wild, level 50 legendary birds. Seamlessly swapping out their beloved early-game catches for a high-voltage Zapdos or an Articuno armed with Blizzard became the authentic, defining strategy to cross the finish line. It was adaptation in its absolute purest form.
Finally, let's evaluate the psychological impact in Section 6, the value of the struggle, and how those digital lessons translate to growth beyond the screen.
Because you see, the journey didn't just end when the credits rolled. After becoming champion, the ultimate hidden depth unlocked, Cerulean Cave. Navigating this treacherous high-level maze to find Mewtwo, and finally using that saved Master Ball, represented the culmination of every single resource decision made since you first stepped out of Pallet Town. Standing in that empty cave, the realization really sets in. They explored an entire world, they solved every puzzle, and they conquered every single challenge alone. The ultimate payoff was earned.
The game itself was just the medium, really. Those 8-bit sprites and the chiptune soundtrack were simply a safe container for genuine growth. It was a place to fail, recover, and strategize. A walkthrough gives you the destination, sure, but the unguided detour is what gives you the experience. The true lesson here was that independent exploration and struggle build a far more capable individual than the easy path ever could. The wrong turns are where the real learning happens.
I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. We now live in an era of ubiquitous walkthroughs and instant answers. Every obstacle can be solved with a quick search. But when we bypass the frustration, what cognitive benefits are we losing? Perhaps the version of you that figures things out independently, that embraces the dark caves and the tough losses without a guide telling you what to do, is far more powerful than any strategy the internet can provide. Thank you for joining me in this explainer. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.